over 25,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the continents of Asia and North America were joined together by a land bridge. It was here that nomadic hunters followed their prey into the New World. Their numbers were small at first, but generation after generation, their numbers grew and they began to move southward. These were the ancestors of the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the American Indian. After the Ice Age ended, the floodwaters rose. The land bridge became the Bering Strait. Around 2000 BC, the Inuits, or Eskimos, arrived by boat in what is now Alaska. These people from ancient Asia became the first Americans. Their cultures varied greatly from one another, and the people flourished for centuries in their new lands. That is, until European explorers discovered the New World and laid claim to its land and riches. We now present a brief history of the Native Americans. Although the term Eskimo is still widely used, some of the native people of Arctic North America refer to themselves as Inuit. The name means the real people. Their language consists of many dialects and is considered one of the most difficult in the world. The family is the strongest social unit, surviving mostly on food from the sea, such as fish, seals, and whales. Single Inuits travel by water in kayaks made from wood and seal skin. Two or more travel in umiaks, large boats made of wood and walrus skins. They travel across land by dog-drawn sleds. Their houses, known as igloos, vary in design. In the summer months, they live in tents made from walrus or seal skin. In the winter, their homes are mainly made from stone covered with moss. The domed igloo, made of snow, is used mainly for long journeys across the ice. For centuries, they have survived in this hostile Arctic land and have become a major political force in their region. Beginning around 300 BC, a civilization of people known as the Mayas lived in parts of southern Mexico, Guatemala, and the Yucatan Peninsula. The Mayan cities were ruled by chiefs, their succession through hereditary bloodlines usually passed on from father to son. The Mayas built huge stone temples to honor their gods. They're remembered for developing two calendars, one of which is quite similar to the ones we use today. Their economy was based on agriculture. The primary crops were beans, squash, cotton, and maize, what we now call corn. They domesticated the dog and the turkey. Their recorded history was written as hieroglyphs, either on stone or paper. Many of these artifacts still exist today. In 980 AD, the Toltec Empire of Mexico invaded the Yucatan Peninsula, but the Mayas were able to survive under their rule. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish conquistadors had conquered most of the Mayan civilization. However, some independent Mayan communities were able to survive up until the beginning of the 20th century. One of the largest ancient empires was that of the Incas of South America. Around 1200 AD, they founded the capital city of Cuzco in what is now Peru. Over several centuries, the Incas defeated many of its neighbors, and by the 16th century, their empire stretched from northern Ecuador to central Chile, some 2,500 miles long and 500 miles wide. The head of their empire, known as the Sapa Inca, was treated like a god. Below him were regional governors, local rulers, and the commoners, who were mostly farmers and laborers. Their most important crops were potatoes and corn. In 1532, Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast with 180 armed men and began his conquest of the Incan Empire. Some of the more notable remains of the Inca civilization are the Temple of the Sun in Cuzco, the walls of Sacsayhuaman, and the famed ruins of Machu Picchu. Between the 14th and 16th century, the Aztec Empire controlled most of central and southern Mexico. According to legend, they built their capital of Tenochtitlan on the site where priests had seen an eagle eating a snake perched atop a cactus. This, they believed, was an ancient prophecy come to life. In 1428, Tenochtitlan formed a military alliance with neighboring city-states. Less than a century later, the Aztecs had assumed complete control of their lands. Aztec society was divided into three classes: nobility, commoner, and slave. In the Aztec religion, animals and humans were sacrificed to the gods by having priests cut out their hearts with sharp knives. By 1519, the great market in Tenochtitlan attracted 60,000 people daily. It was here that a great number of goods were imported and exported. It was also during this time that the Spanish arrived in Mexico, led by Hernan Cortez. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma II thought Cortez to be the god Quetzalcoatl and openly welcomed him. In 1520, Cortez had Montezuma killed, and by the following year, the Aztec Empire was destroyed. Mexico City, the modern capital of Mexico, is built upon the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Over 1 million ancestors of the Aztecs live in that region to this day. Now that we have discussed the empires of Mexico and South America and the Inuits of the Arctic, we will explore the history of the Indian tribes of North America. One of the oldest tribes was that of the Anasazis. Starting around 100 BC, their culture began to grow on the Colorado Plateau. Their dwellings, some of which were built on the side of cliffs, survive to this day. In the late 13th century, a severe drought afflicted the Southwest, and the Anasazis abandoned their region and eventually vanished as a people. Between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains lies the Great Plains of America. In the early 1300s, many tribes began to settle this vast area of land. They were the Pawnees and Wichitas of Nebraska, the Mandans of the Missouri Valley, and the Sioux, Crow, and Blackfoot who settled in the northern plains. The Cheyennes moved into the central plains, and the Comanches settled the southern plains. The horse had not yet been exported to the New World, so the Plains Indians hunted buffalo by foot. Several tribes planted and harvested crops of corn, squash, beans, and tobacco. This was their land, untouched by the outside world, but soon this would change. The Iroquois, a group of tribes joined together by a common language, lived in the northeast region of America. The Iroquois were mighty warriors, forever waging war on their neighbors. This continued up until 1450, when Hiawatha, one of their chiefs, helped in the creation of the Iroquois League. This league consisted of 5 major tribes: the Mohawks, Cayugas, Senecas, Oneidas, and Onondagas. The land was divided among the 5 tribes, with each having a council to govern it. Major disputes were resolved by the Great Council. This council was composed of 50 representatives from the 5 tribes, with one of those seats reserved for Hiawatha. This was one of the earliest forms of democracy in the New World. The warring Iroquois were finally at peace. In 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain commissioned Italian explorer Christopher Columbus to sail across the Atlantic Ocean in hopes of finding a westward route to India. He landed in the Bahamian Islands in October of that year. Thinking he was in the East Indies of Asia, he called the inhabitants of the islands Los Indios, or the Indians. And although there were more than 500 distinct tribes in North America, the name Indians has remained for more than 500 years. Columbus' fateful voyage led to countless other explorations to the New World. With each new expedition, the Europeans brought with them diseases that would prove deadly to the natives. In 1516, a smallpox epidemic in the New World killed at least half of all the Native Americans who came in contact with it. In 1607, the English colony of Jamestown was founded in Virginia. According to legend, its leader, John Smith, was captured by the Powhatan Indians. About to be executed, the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, had her father spare his life. Pocahontas later went on to marry English colonist John Rolfe and travel to England. On her return voyage, she contracted smallpox and died at the age of 22. The year 1620 saw the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. The following year, they came in contact with the native inhabitants. An Abenaki Indian named Samoset came out of the woods and spoke English he had learned from European fishermen. Using Samoset and another Indian named Tisquantum as translators, the Pilgrims made peace with the leader of the Wampanoag tribe, who was called Massasoit. They agreed to help one another in case of attack by a third party. The Indians taught the Pilgrims which crops to plant and where to fish. During the harvest season, the Pilgrims and Indians gathered for a 3-day festival in order to give thanks for their bounty. The celebration, they decided, would become an annual event. Today, we know this holiday as Thanksgiving. For 40 years, there was peace between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags. But with Massasoit's death in 1662 and the expansion of English settlements, the peace collapsed. Puritans began to force the Indians to live according to their religious beliefs and customs. Soon, Indian tribes began to attack the English settlements. Under the leadership of Metacom, known to the Puritans as King Philip, the Wampanoags, along with the Narragansetts and Nipmunks, waged war in New England. By 1676, the Puritans had killed more than 3,000 Indians and had driven them out of southern New England. King Philip was captured, shot through the heart, and beheaded. His head was put on a pole and displayed in Plymouth for 20 years. In 1626, Peter Inuit, the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, which later became New York, bought the island of Manhattan from the Canarsie Indians for the sum of $24. With this newly acquired land, more colonists began to appear, and the Indian culture of the Northeast began to disappear. Between 1636 and 1637, the Puritans waged war against the Pequots of Connecticut in an effort to claim their lands and riches. They succeeded, and the entire tribe was literally wiped out of existence. By the end of the 1600s, more and more tribes were forced westward. By the 17th century, horses which had been exported from Europe were roaming the Southwest, and the Plains Indians began to use them in their hunt for the mighty buffalo. The horses also enabled the Indians to develop a more nomadic lifestyle. During the French and Indian War, which began in 1754, several Indian nations joined forces with the French in their fight against the British. They believed the French would treat them more fairly than the English colonists. Unfortunately, the French lost the war in 1763. France was forced to cede Canada and lands belonging to the Indians around the Great Lakes. During the American Revolution, which began in 1775, many Indians joined forces with the British. When the British surrendered in 1783, the Indians lost any hope of regaining their land. By 1800, there were only 600,000 Native Americans left in the United States. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson was responsible for purchasing the Louisiana Territory from the French. Stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, the Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States. Jefferson then sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore this newly acquired land. They took along with them a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea to act as an interpreter. 16 months into the expedition, they came across a Shoshone tribe. Just by coincidence, the chief of the tribe was Sacagawea's brother, who she had not seen since she was a little girl. The Shoshone provided Lewis and Clark with horses and more guides. Along the way, they also received assistance from the Nez Perce tribe. In his journal, Lewis wrote that they were the most hospitable, honest, and sincere people that we have met on our voyage. It was with the help of these Native Americans that Lewis and Clark were able to reach the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. The Lewis and Clark expedition opened up the West to America. Jefferson believed it would take 40 generations to settle the U.S. from coast to coast. It would take only 4. In 1824, the United States government established the Bureau of Indian Affairs in their ongoing efforts to deal with the Native American population, which now numbered 471,000. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act. It allowed for the moving of all Indians to lands west of the Mississippi River. In 1834, Indian territory was set aside in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. On these lands, the government would later establish reservations. It was here that they would try to assimilate the Indians to their way of life, including their conversion to Christianity. As more and more people settled west, they brought with them their diseases. Between 1837 and 1870, there were 4 major epidemics of smallpox among the many tribes. Since the European arrival to the New World, 90% of the Indian population died from disease alone. In 1838, the U.S. Army moved Cherokees from Georgia to a reservation in Oklahoma. Known as the Trail of Tears, the tiring journey cost the lives of 1/4 of the Cherokees. In 1845, an editor named John O'Sullivan wrote that it was the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly expanding millions. The idea of manifest destiny spread throughout the nation. With the U.S. victory in the Mexican War in 1848, the United States acquired new lands in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada Territory. That same year, gold was discovered in California. By the end of 1849, some 80,000 people had made their trek west in search of their riches. Soon, the federal government began to abolish land set aside for the Indians. It was during the Civil War in 1862 that Congress passed the Homestead Act, which gave 160 acres of land free to any settler who resided on it for 5 years. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, white settlers, now more than ever, moved westward. With the settlement of the West came the slaughter of the buffalo. To the Great Plains Indian, the buffalo was essential for survival. Their hides were used for clothing and shelter. Their meat was used for food. Their hoofs were used for utensils and glue, and their bladder was used for storage pouches. To the white men, they were either killed for profit or hunted for fun. By 1895, the buffalo, which had once numbered 70 million, were fewer than 1,000. One of the most famous battles of the Indian Wars was that of the Battle of Little Bighorn that took place in southern Montana in 1876. It was here that charismatic General George Armstrong Custer led his army against a coalition of Sioux tribes under the leadership of Chief Sitting Bull and Chief Crazy Horse. Clearly outnumbered, Custer and 263 of his men were killed in less than half an hour. When news of Custer's last stand reached the east, the United States government became more determined than ever to destroy the will of the Native American people. In 1877, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, determined not to be forced into a reservation, led his people on a 1,500-mile trek through Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Before they were able to reach Canada, the U.S. Army caught up with them. Chief Joseph could do little else but surrender. "Hear me, chiefs," he said. "I'm tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." In 1886, resistance fighters in the Southwest, led by famed Apache leader Geronimo, surrendered to the U.S. Army after 5 years of armed conflict. Living in exile after the Battle of Little Bighorn, Chief Sitting Bull surrendered to U.S. troops in 1881. Eventually, he was forced to live on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. He was so famous among the white people that he briefly toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which recreated his victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn. When he returned to his reservation, he encouraged his people to practice a ritual known as the ghost dance. According to legend, the ghost dance would make the white people vanish from their land forever. Lakota police were sent to arrest Sitting Bull, and in the ensuing melee, he was shot in the chest and head. Sitting Bull was killed by his own people. Fearing for their lives, Sitting Bull's followers fled. The U.S. Army quickly followed. On December 28, 1890, the Army caught up with and surrounded the Indians. They were taken to a creek called Wounded Knee in South Dakota. The following morning, the troops began to disarm the Indians. A gun accidentally went off, and the soldiers opened fire. When it was all over, more than 200 Indian men, women, and children were dead. After the massacre at Wounded Knee, the ghost dance was rarely performed again. It was also the last major conflict between the Indians and the whites. By the turn of the 20th century, only 267,000 Native Americans remained. The Citizen Act of 1924 made all Indians citizens of the United States while still keeping their tribal status. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, which gave funds to help rebuild the Native American culture. During World War II, more than 25,000 Native Americans enlisted for service in the armed forces and fought bravely for their country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 restored tribal law to the Indian reservations. In 1973, activists of the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and demanded that the United States honor its treaties made with the Indians over the last 2 centuries. The FBI was sent in and attacked the activists. When it was all over, 2 Indians and 1 federal marshal were dead. Since the 1970s, the Native American population has flourished. When the last census was taken in 1990, almost 2 million people claimed to be Native American. Since the early 80s, legalized gambling on Indian reservations has produced revenues in excess of $3 billion and has turned the Native American population into a strong political power. Although much of their land and culture has been destroyed over the centuries, the Native Americans continue to endure. A once proud people now have the political and economic means to be proud once again.